recently, a Māori woman got flagged as a criminal unjustly. It got her shamed massively, even though the AI was wrong in flagging her. Their side leads to a world where this is the regular and the norm wide scale. The way we win this debate is by proving that AI is ineffective, firstly by saying that it's racist, or second by proving that it can't actually catch criminals. Then I'll be going into my point on bias, and then on my point about why it's ineffective, but I'll start with some light framing here. We think supermarkets are especially greedy in New Zealand. Note wording of emotion, this is set in New Zealand. They raise prices of essential goods even as people starve, and they already report high profit margins, right? So they want to squeeze every penny. They don't care if people get hurt along the way. So it means they won't care about bias if it saves a single penny of their money, right? They don't care about any of that. They just want to maximize profit. So to get into my first point on bias, which I'm going to spend most of my time on because I think it's the most important point of this debate, right? So first, on AI, right? It's trained first. It's not trained by supermarkets or else it won't work, right? And it's far too expensive for supermarkets to train AI. It's not their expertise. So it means tech companies from America do it, right? Because all the tech companies are from America that make AI in the first place. We're all from Silicon Valley. We don't really have NZ AI tech companies, right? So, first of all, there's data bias, right? So AI is trained on data, and when the data itself is biased, when Māori are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, it means that when other smaller communities are barely even included, right, in the training data, then the AI develops these own biases, right? It scans a Māori face, the data says it's a criminal, right? It flags it, even though it's not true, just because the data it's been trained on thinks that that Māori person is a criminal, right? And with these lesser represented groups, it can't even flag them as criminals in the first place. It's just not being trained on their data, right? Secondly, media narratives are biased, right? If an AI trains on media stories, what stories does the media play? The stories that play are ones that get clicks, that play into society's racist biases, right? That really get rich old white men's jimmies in a twist when they read their news report about the local Māori woman stealing from the supermarket, because that's something that really makes them mad. It justifies their biases that they've held because of the way they've been raised with them, right? So it means if it's trained on media narratives, the AI is still biased. Thirdly, there's omission bias, right? Crimes of Pākehā are not marked down as committing crime. Like, think about in the past, right, where police may have been more biased, right, towards Pākehā. They may have been more willing to overlook their crimes, where the inverse is true for Māori people, right? Because there was a lot of racism in the past towards these people, right? There were a lot of miscarriages of justice towards these people, right? And fourthly, this is foreign tech, right? So it means even after all of this, it's not even being made in New Zealand, right? These Americans don't have any incentive to care about the struggles of some indigenous group in New Zealand. They have no reason to care in the first place. They just want to satisfy the supermarket who wants to save as much money as possible.
On that point.
And then onto people, right? First of all, we say that people have to pay really high prices for these goods. There's a cost of living crisis. So when they think someone has stolen, they're cheating the system. They've been socialized by media to hate criminals. Think about how there's so many news reports about these dastardly criminals taking away and not contributing to the society they work so hard for. It makes them, they really care about this. Two, they want to be seen as good. When you stand out and call out criminals or people you think are criminals, right, it makes you seem virtuous. It makes you seem like a good person, which means you gain social status. It also makes you feel like a better person because you think you're standing against these criminals, right? And third, we think these people trust authority implicitly. They're used to trusting authority. They've listened to law enforcement their entire life. They listen to teachers their entire life. They probably listen to their parents their entire life. They're used to trusting authority, right? So they don't call out authority like the supermarket saying this person is a criminal when they hear about it, right? And to touch on minorities, right, we say they're disenfranchised because they've been historically exploited, historically mistreated. They don't trust the system, which means they're unlikely to engage with it because they perceive it to be as useless and not a good use of their time. So they struggle to actually organize to stand against this sort of thing. And second of all, they're a minority. By definition, their voices will be drowned out by the majority, right?
On that point.
They struggle to create change because there's just not enough of them, right? So on the impacting here, first of all, on minorities, so Māori, Pacifica, Asian communities, right? They get pinged way more often. They get pulled aside and confronted, even if they're not committing a crime, simply because the AI thinks that they're a criminal, right? Which means, first of all, they get shamed in front of the entire supermarket when they're out with their family. Think about the example of that Māori woman, right? She gets shamed in front of all of these people of her community. They all think she's a criminal now. They all think she's stealing. Even though she's not, right? It means that you feel isolated from your community. It others you even more. You're less likely to go to social events. It means that you've got no support network in place because now all these people that before you could turn to, now they just think you're a criminal. Why should they help you, right?
On that point.
And furthermore, it affirms racist narratives to the public. There's already a racist narrative that Māori are the people that commit the most crimes, that they are the lazy people in society, right? And it just affirms this narrative even more. It means you've got a more racist society when people can justify their own biases with lived examples of people that were perceived to be criminals because the AI flagged them as so, right? Which means you get a society that is more racist, more willing to ignore the plights of these people. And we care because minorities are so disenfranchised right now. They have little power to stop this, right? They experience very real material harms of racism from the public, and as they're often the most disprivileged people in public because of the lack of historical support to their needs, right? I'll take a point now.
How do you think facial recognition software recognizes faces?
It's got to be trained on the data, as I've said. If you don't feed it data, then it can't recognize faces because it hasn't been trained in the first place, as I've already covered in my first point. Okay, to get on my second point, why it's ineffective, first of all, just note here, you're not actually solving the root cause of stealing. It's just going to keep on happening, right? And we think that criminals are willing to take measures to avoid punishment, right? But you just don't want to get punished. So, first of all, you can just go to a store that doesn't have facial recognition, which means the local businesses in this note that it says World, PAK'nSAVE, right? These are big businesses. So you're going to go to a local business, not PAK'nSAVE, or just other stores in general. And these small businesses have less resources. So we think this is especially important because each stolen good is relatively worth more than if it were stolen from, say, PAK'nSAVE or New World, right? Second of all, they can just change how they look. Like, makeup exists, right? I can just wear sunglasses and it's way harder to recognize my face. You can just avoid cameras, right? You can wear a mask. There's all sorts of ways to change the way your face looks to make it harder to flag for AI. That's already been tested, like, before, right? And third of all, it's already biased, as I said, so you're not actually getting criminals, you're just accusing innocents, so you're taking away resources to catch these criminals in the first place. And fourthly, people get complacent, right? AI seems to do your job for you as a guard, so why should you have to focus on the more innocent-looking criminals? You just focus on the obvious ones, right? You have spent more time confronting innocent people, even if they're not stealing, right? It means that you're just complacent, you think your job's already done. You don't have to put a lot of effort into it. What this means is that, first of all, the actual criminals just get away because they've already put so much time and resource, they're willing to do these sorts of things to get away with it, right? Second of all, security's more complacent, so these criminals have even more leeway to get away with stealing, right? But third of all, small stores are hurt far more by this. It means that these small stores are now blunting the force of these criminals rather than large major stores which have far more resources to weather these kinds of things. So you're actually shutting down these smaller businesses who really depend on every single piece of bread that they have in stock to sell, right? So at the end of this, we see their side doesn't actually solve any problems, but simply makes them worse and lets criminals get away while they unjustly target minorities who we think are the most important. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech and now invite up the first speaker of the negative one.
When the responsibility of catching a 6'4" criminal who's just shoplifted your store falls to a 15-year-old 5'2" girl, we think there is something inherently wrong with the responsibilities placed on that girl. We think there is something inherently wrong with not having an AI or not having facial recognition software that can do our jobs for us. What do I have for you in this speech? Firstly, how this is going to provide greater prevention of crime. 2, the impact on employees. 3, how this impacts people actually getting kicked out of the store. But before I go to that, I'm just going to start with some rebuttal. Now, the huge thrust out of side F was that software is racist. And I'd like to know that they use the words AI, they're training this AI. Now, I'm going to refer back to the info slide where it's not an AI, it's using facial recognition tech. we'd just like to very clearly characterize the fact that facial recognition tech doesn't need a training bank. It doesn't need to be able to look at, the news stories that Side Aff tried to say they use. What they do is they have a biometric analysis of the facial features. They look at the exact set of somebody's eyes, they look at the colors and pigmentations and the structure of their nose, and they say that is the person who came in 2 weeks ago and put this ham in their shirt and it wasn't registered or logged in what they paid. That is facial recognition software. It is not ChatGPT Supermarket Edition, right? It is distinctly and only used to identify who the person actually is. So just like to make very clear that all of the mechanisms they gave us, all the points that flow on from this AI being racist, this AI being unfair, simply doesn't hold. But let's assume that they are right. How does this still fall apart? Firstly, we think it only takes one rich Māori boy to get discriminated against and then have their mum kick up a fuss, and then the moment that it's found out the AI software that they have used and trained is inherently racist, that is when it all falls apart. That is when they go up to the Supreme Court we were in just 30 minutes ago, and that is when things actually start changing. Okay, now, I've also got some other points, just responding to their point, it moves to small stores get hurt more. No, I think small stores have a unique way of responding to crime, which is that they're just smaller. The person sitting in the cash, at the cash register can actually see everything that's happening. Solving the root cause of crime, we do that better. Why? Because we're going to explain this later, but basically, we have a greater deterrent for crime, because a AI that sees your face and can see you no matter what a mask is always doing better. Furthermore, when it comes to the point about disguises, in your best case, it's symmetrical. A human won't be able to recognize you either. In the actual case, though, we think that AI has the capacity to look at your faces, to be able to look at the pigmentation in your eyes, look at your exact bone structure in a way that a human never can, and identify you from that. Okay, so we think that AIs will provide greater analysis. Now, moving on to my first point, which is why AIs can provide a greater prevention of crime. We have the point that I brought up in rebuttal, which is just that AIs can actually identify, not an AI, sorry, ignore all of the words I use when I say AI, that's just their points. What I specifically and exclusively mean is facial recognition software. How does this work? The facial recognition software can look at your face as you come in, it can then match you when you come back out. We think this is incredibly accurate, we think this is incredibly valuable. What's the difference though? Right? We think that means that we have got a better capacity to catch someone who commits a crime. We'd like to note now a couple of points. Firstly, when someone shoplifts, they accept the consequences. They have broken the laws of the land, they have deliberately committed a crime, and in doing so, they acknowledge and accept that if they get punished, that is what they deserve, right? We think that's something we'd really importantly like to note, that we actually stand for punishing shoplifters. Now, moving away from that, who do we think is actually shoplifting? It looks like Scots college kids who don't want to have to pay for the bag of M&Ms they want because their dad hasn't given them their allowance for the week, but they just want to have some treats. Look at the Scots college kids nodding in the audience. They clearly prove that point is true, right? We think that they have an apathy of life and we don't care about. Now, what do we think is primarily being stolen from shops? This looks like someone who wants to go out to have a party, but they don't have the cash to go, so they like to bring beers along, so they go steal it, right? We think that it is primarily amenities being stolen. How does this change? The greatest point is that facial recognition software is far more likely to catch them and it provides a far greater deterrent. Why does that work? Firstly, it is just way more capable of identifying you. Secondly, it's a pretty, we think that there is a deterrent in the fact that if your face is being stored in PAK'nSAVE software, we think that is a pretty great deterrent. They'll be able to recognize who you are, right? We think that's a deterrent, especially for someone who's is got a fear of the government and doesn't want to commit crimes. So we think that is an incredibly powerful point, which we think that we've now just got a far greater deterrent for stopping crime. Now, moving on to the second point, which is how this harms employees, right? We think this, even if their material is all true, we think we can still win on this point just because of how damaging and dangerous it is actually for an employee. The context of this point is that the responsibility for catching a shoplifter lies in the average everyday employee. What this means is that if I'm working on a till, I have to say, you're the shoplifter, you, security guard, come over here. She was the one stealing, right? We think that the response, and we think that's the best case. We think the far more likely case is that you just have to go up and say, hello, noting that New World store policy is that I have to talk to them 3 times. I have to talk to this criminal 3 different times before saying, hey, you, get out of the store, right? We'd like to note here that this is going to be an incredible, a distinct harm. But before I get onto those mechanisms, firstly, right, we just think that the counterfactual is that when you have the facial recognition software, that when the person walked out having stolen last time, they're now in the database. They look at the facial recognition software looks at the seat of your nose and says, yes, I know that that is the exact same person. What does that now mean? When you walk in the door, there's a ding going off. The manager who's sitting there just goes, okay, band person walks in, hey, band person, can you just like pop outside? One would like to also know that this engages with their material, that it's a whole lot less invasive than when you've just like bought all of your goods and then you walk out and then you get banned, right? We think this is far more powerful. Now, continuing this point, what actually happens? Right, we think there is an aspect, firstly, where it's physically intimidating to have to kick someone out of a store. What does that look like? We've given you the example of like you're a 5'2" girl who's working the cash register and a 6'4" guy is there. Right, we think that's a huge problem because the current deterrent that happens in supermarket chains is that the reason you don't steal is because someone just came up to you and you go, okay, they know your face, right? We think that's incredibly scary if you've got to be the person to stop that. I'll take your POI now.
Yeah. Do you think that this technology is trained equally on all facial structures?
Yes. Why? Because we think that a shop has a direct incentive to be able to catch everyone who's shoplifting. If I'm New World, I don't want white guys to get away with stealing my product. Profit incentive is like, let's go equality, let's catch everyone robbing me, right? We think that's completely a point for us. Thank you. So, moving on to the next bit here, right? We think that there is now a huge harm that if like you're the employee and it's your job to kick somebody out of the store, we think this builds into more expectations, like the manager expects you to get out, to kick this person out, or you get punished. This adds stress, this adds fear. Now, what happens if you get this person wrong, right? Like, firstly, you don't have to know that you kicked out the wrong person. That's incredibly scary. Why? You feel like an absolutely trashy person if you kick someone out of the store. Secondly, if you get the wrong person, your manager will be punishing you, you've got a threat of retribution, you feel bad, and we think that's just generally a distinct harm. Now, my third point, which is what actually happens on who gets kicked out. Notably, there is an inherent racial bias, which we think is terrible. We think this is terrible when we have humans doing it. Why? Because if I am now a shop owner and $600 of beer just got stolen from my store, what happened? It was a brown boy in a Wellington college uniform. What happens when the next brown boy walks into a Wellington college uniform? In the best case scenario, I'm going to be sitting there, watching them, glaring at them, like, he's trying to steal my livelihood again, right? We think in the best case, you're intimidating them. In the more accurate cases, hey, that looks like the person who just stole. It probably is, hey, you get out of my store. What's the harm for the person who gets kicked out? You're being systematically racially profiled against. You've got a huge harm in the fact that you just feel oppressed and you feel like excluded from society. Now, what happens if you're a person who actually does shoplift? Right, we'd like to note now there is a distinct mechanism where we decrease the amount of shoplifting. What is that? You've got a greater deterrent, you feel more likely to be caught. We think this is like, if you know that you're like, there is software and like no matter which store you go into, you'll always be caught, you're so much less likely to shoplift. We actually stop this crime and we actually like get rid of the most harmful, pernicious impacts in this debate. We are proud to negate.
I thank the speaker for their speech and now invite up the second member of the Affirmative team.
Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. If I had the time, it would probably be fitting to start with a karakia kai, because as today, I'm going to eat. In my speech today, I'm going to be delivering some rebuttal, I'll be filling out the characterization and the mechanization, we heard it rightly, and then I'll be moving on to a substantive push, a modest substantive in my split on the logistical harms of implementation. Okay, but firstly, to begin with some rebuttal. Note that we flagged this. What kind of data is the AI likely to be trained upon? I'll get into this, I'll get into this now actually, because we think that this is important, right? If we can't agree on how this AI is trained and where it comes from, then we can't have a reasonable debate. So why is our characterization more likely? We think that like facial recognition, yeah, it sounds less like new than AI, it's less of a buzzword, but that doesn't mean that it works structurally differently. At the end of the day, if you just like look at the biometrics as we heard from them, you still have to show them the biometrics of a Māori person, and we think that when this training data is going to be inevitably biased, we think at that point that the real life outcomes are always going to be just as biased. It doesn't just magically work by like, this is what a nose looks like, now find everyone with that nose and like
put them into jail. What it actually looks like is you have to teach them the biometrics. There has to be a degree of training data. So why is this important? We think that this training data is obviously not going to come from New Zealand because there's not Kiwi AI companies, and even if they are, they're going to be too expensive compared to just outsourcing it to Silicon Valley. So what happens then? We pick up data that was never intended for Māori, never intended for Pacifica, and we pick up all the bias against African Americans straight from America and import it into our supermarkets. Next, rebuttal. So you can't just show, this next thing we heard about like how rich, all it takes is one rich Māori to cause a fuss and fix it. What we think is that like even if you do get this and like cool analogy, Supreme Court is there, correct. But supermarkets aren't just going to fix it because the Supreme Court tells them that like racism is bad. At the end of the day, Supreme Courts aren't going to fix it because of the cost. Why is this true? Think of the status quo, where there is racism, as they conceded. Like, a shopkeeper is going to be racist. The Supreme Court can say this is bad all they like, but it's not going to stop people from being racist. So ultimately, it's not going to incentivize people from getting better AI into their supermarkets.
On that point,
Okay, we think that it's really funny for them to get up and be like, we stand for punishing Scots college kids. Like, great. At the end of the day, we also stand for reducing crime, right? But when you don't engage in all the mechanization we gave you at Riley about why you just like can't effectively reduce crime by this point falls apart. Beyond this, to margin build on this point, kids aren't going to be on the record if they didn't get caught. So what you're doing is you're not going to be punishing the ones who can successfully steal, because Scots college kids will probably know how to put like an M&M tube down their pockets. At the end of the day, those kids that aren't going to be on the record initially won't be caught on your side, and as I'll get to in my substantive, they just don't get caught at all. Okay, next thing, we think it's great framing to talk about like 5'2" minimum wage kids. As a short king myself, I'm going to defeat this. So what is the role, so in stopping criminals, why doesn't it put like kids into extra harm's way on our side? We think that this falls apart at the point where it's just like, if you are a short and small minimum wage kid working at New World, you can just go up to the security guard and be like, hey, that person's a thief. It doesn't have to be like, oi, there's a thief there. So what is the most recent example we can think of where it did go like, oi, there's a thief there? It was New World in the Waikato, where this Māori woman was caught being completely innocent, and she was like apprehended and shamed in front of the entire supermarket because the AI thought that she was a thief. So what side do we actually end up getting these confrontations in the supermarket? It is on their side of the house. Okay, they gave us this characterization about like quietly stopping banned people outside of the supermarket, but it's not a quiet step out of the store. As I've said, on the AI side of the house, it just looks like everyone look at this lady, coincidentally, yeah, she happens to be Māori, she happens to be innocent, causes huge harm to her. At least that's one thing we can both agree on, is the harms caused to innocent people that get caught. Okay, I'll take a point.
this debate is about reoffenders. How, under your side, do you think a manager stops a reoffender from coming back into their store?
We think on our side, they stop them just how they always have. It's when you recognize someone, and ultimately when you can't trust your recognition because you're not like AI or whatever, you just don't stop the people from coming into your store. So yeah, there is like a degree of shoplifting on our side of the house, but we think that if people are getting away with the shoplifting, which is how it happens on our side, they're not going to be spotted by an AI, so they're not going to be logged by an AI, so they're not going to be stopped from entering New World Metro next time that they try to do that. Who is going to be stopped is the people who are biased by the training data. Note that this training data bias happens on a few different levels. Firstly, we've got Māori and Pacifica. They're overrepresented in like the data itself. They're overrepresented by data omission bias because you're probably not counting every time a Pākehā steals from your store. And finally, they're overrepresented in media narratives. What this creates is biased training data leading to a feedback loop. But it doesn't stop there. What this means for other minorities is that they're probably not recognised because ultimately, this is facial recognition service that has come from Silicon Valley. It's not intended to be used in this circumstance, and the supermarkets are not going to care about that. So what this looks like, as we saw in like the example in Japan, where phones like would unlock for everyone because the training data of the facial recognition wasn't done right. This was before AI, this was facial recognition, right? But what this means on their side, if you just import this data without using AI, just say it's biometric facial recognition, if one Asian person steals from a shop, it is going to flag many innocent people. We tell you this is worse because they are minorities, because they are innocent, causes huge harm. But again, even after that, it doesn't stop there. And note that we're already covering like a huge percentage of the population. So if you buy that it's going to slightly harm Māori, slightly harm Pacifica, slightly harm Asian people, we are ultimately like, there is huge harm to a lot of the population on their side of the house. It doesn't stop there. If you're getting cheap, dodgy data from Silicon Valley, you are likely to be playing on American biases in the training data. This looks like emission bias, media narratives, and overrepresentation in data. So what this means is that African Americans in New Zealand are ultimately going to also receive all of these harms. So they cannot escape all of these harms just by saying, oh, instead of using AI, we're going to use facial recognition. Boom. Because at the end of the day, facial recognition is equally biased. You still require training data. That training data is going to be biased, and your outcomes are going to be biased too. What this looks like is before AI, when it was just biometrics and facial recognition, because that was the flash words of the day, you had that incident where all the phones were unlocking in Japan. You had that incident where the Scottish man couldn't use the voice recognition in the elevator and he got stuck. At the end of the day, you can't just escape the harms that we clearly mechanize by saying, oh, we're not going to be using AI, we're going to use facial recognition. We think bias is the most important point in today's debate, which is why we gave you 2 mechs and 9 sub-mechs at Riley. Note that a lot of this was unresponded to beyond just trying to say, oh, we're not using AI. So I'll move on to my split super quickly about the logistical harms of implementation. Don't need to spend too much time here. There are basically 5 ways that this happens. It creates a false sense of security, as we told you. Secondly, security guards get complacent. It's often used instead of security guards, and people are scared by it, right? There's this invasion of privacy. We live in a society literally 1984. Finally, there's less checkout operators, less supermarkets, less security guards. So what is the outcome of this? Theft gets worse, and that takes away a huge part of their benefit. We're directly engaging in their case. What happens then is supermarkets increase their prices to cover the asset loss. Secondly, people feel invaded, and there's harms to that inherently because they feel less safe and they don't trust the government as much. And finally, when you have that job loss, firstly, you're losing jobs in the community, but secondly, you're losing a huge degree of connection for older people. Maybe the only time they speak to a real person during the day is the checkout operator or the security guard they say hi to at New World. So at the end of this, they cannot escape the harms of bias. They cannot stop shoplifting. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and now invite the second speaker of the negative team up.
The alternative to facial recognition software is still having photos of these alleged offenders up on your community notice board saying, have you seen this person? The alternative is still your manager looking out for a Māori boy in a particular uniform in order to exert his racial biases. The alternative is not a perfect utopia where no one has any bias because there's no AI running the show. The alternative is the very human bias that those AI, they say, were trained on, and we think that that leads to much more profiling. So 2 questions today, and then an extension on employee fear and anxiety, right? The first one is on profiling, and the second question is on humiliation. But know that these are really intrinsically linked because as soon as you get profiling, you get unfair humiliation, right? So firstly on profiling, we want to note that as the Affirmative explains, profiling in society is quite pervasive, especially in crime prevention, right? That's why you see racist police. That's why you see the case of the Māori woman in the Waikato, right? But what this means is that racial profiling and other forms of profiling in terms of class and how you're dressed and how you act and what your behavior is like, right? This profiling already happens. It means that these money-greedy corporations are already putting their biases on blast and persecuting people unjustly based on skin color and clothing, rather than the legitimate truth, right? And both sides are arguing for the fact that this is bad, that we don't want racial profiling. But what we've proven to you and flagged in POIs is that actually facial recognition software is much more accurate than just a person who is quite quite afraid to have this, intimidating boy that they saw a couple weeks ago in their shop, and is therefore going to push that bias onto other people. We explain to you that at our first speech, and we flag it again later on. But therefore, right, this profiling point is about accuracy, which side is more accurately identifying these reoffenders, and which side sufficiently mitigates these people whose lives are being upheaved by unfair profiling, right? So let's look at that. They argue that facial recognition software is biased. They say it's trained with racial biases. They say they're given USA data sets with, entrenched racism in them. They say that this software is being bought from Silicon Valley because that's the cheapest route. They say that it's trained by racist supermarkets want to squeeze money out of people, even if it means unfairly profiling, right? So firstly, we don't really know what the affirmative means when they say trained. We have to assume that it looks like the same sort of data training that other AI platforms would have, and that looks like feeding these AI platforms like, this is what a match looks like, this is what a match doesn't look like. The reason why we think that that's unfair of them to characterize in this debate is that actually the motion is about reoffenders and identifying people who have once been in your store, been seen to be a shoplifter, and who you don't want to come back anymore, right? So that's why I bring up in my introduction the community notice board of, have you seen this person before? Because that's the alternative, right? The security camera catches you with a bottle of wine under your arm, but then you leave the store and the employees at the register don't know when you come back because they don't remember what you look like. Alternatively, if they do remember what you look like, you get this profiling that we're talking about, right? So as we explained in our first speech, it's not a guessing game that the supermarket should be doing. It's not the supermarket GBT that they try and characterize to you. It's biometric analysis that's trying to match the face of the person coming into the supermarket with the face of someone in the software who has already been caught to be shoplifting, right? So their point on trained bias is misconstrued at best because the data it's using is the supermarket's record of offenders, right? That's what's actually happening, is that this machine has a record of, hundreds, a couple years back of people who not a single manager could possibly remember, who are then going to get flagged and kicked out of the store, which we think is a benefit. But also, we don't think we have this profiling because facial recognition software is more accurate than a racist manager, okay? So it's the photos that New World has of the people with stuff slipped under their arms that under our side would be immediately pinged as a reoffender if he were to walk in again. But under their side, it's two options, right? Firstly, this man is profiled because of the racial biases that humans hold, right? And then that harm of him being profiled flows on to harm anyone who looks like him, which has immense harms, as they very nicely characterize to you. Because even though we think their mechanisms about AI bias aren't particularly relevant to this situation, their point of bias is important to us because it's something we also want to avoid. We know that bias exists on their side of the house because we hear all these stories, right? We hear all these stories about you're in the same uniform, you have the same skin color, you're about the same height. I'm going to either intimidate you, unfairly kick you out of my store, publicly shame you, right? We see that happening on their side all the damn time. And without the software that we're introducing, we think that it can't ever be as accurate as what a computer could do if it analyzed the shape of the person on the photo's nose, if it analyzed their height, their bone structure, their eye set, right? So yes, we agree that profiling is a really big thing in this debate, right? Because we're talking about this group of stakeholders who haven't done anything wrong and are going to be affected. But we think, as we've proven to you, that profiling looks much worse on their side because it actually is being doing by something that's much more flawed. We actually do argue that humans are more flawed in their logic, reasoning, and recognition of faces than a machine, AI or not, right? They tell you that we're using these buzzwords. We think that regardless, artificial or not, the intelligence of facial recognition software is always going to use evidence and data based on these photos, as opposed to the intrinsic biases that white manager probably has about every single Māori boy that walks into his store, right? When the facial recognition software makes a decision and says, this is the same person that you saw 2 weeks ago, you can trust that that's true, rather than thinking that your manager is probably just a little bit racist and is doing this unfairly. And obviously, that profiling has those massive harms that we give to you at our first speech. But let's move on to humiliation, because I think that this is quite important in this debate, because there is something about crime prevention that says, okay, as well as deterring crime, we should also do it in a respectful way to these people. We should also take into account who they are and what situation they're in, right? And so we hear this great example from the Affirmative team about how, like publicly humiliating this woman for shoplifting even though she needed it to survive, was a terrible harm, right? But we tell you at our first speech that under our side we have minimal confrontation, we have a much higher degree of certainty, we have a much more streamlined law enforcement system for shoplifters, we have a much more efficient and more accurate way of identifying who has stolen, and it's not as public, right? Because again, the alternative is that incredibly humiliating public notice board that says, have you seen this woman? Have you seen this man? Please point her out to us, publicly shame her, right? That is the point of a community notice board like that. It aims to deter crime the same way that we do, with a deterrent like, we will catch you, right? But it does it in a much more humiliating way for that mother, that same Māori woman that they talk about, right? So under their side, it's confrontation, or they're not caught, the employees are on edge. I'll take a point now.
Why would a racist manager at PAK'nSAVE or New World stop being racist because the store got AI?
Because he wouldn't be in charge of it anymore and the AI wouldn't be as racist as him, right? But on my extension about employee fear, we think that employee anxiety gets much, much lower under our side of the house when the onus is not on the employee to be constantly hyper-vigilant to catch these supposed criminals, right? We actually do think that it's okay for an employee to be complacent because, as we've proven to you, facial recognition software works and is really good in this case because it takes the pressure off of that 15-year-old girl who really doesn't want to walk up to that 6'4" man who, looks a little like sketchy and ask him how his day's going and if he knows that we know you're stealing, right? Like, that's actually not something very pleasant for a very young supermarket, for a very sort of like unexperienced supermarket cashier to be doing. It's not something we want to force onto them. It's something we'd rather have a facial recognition software do, right? So we think that that employee fear of like, I don't know when this man who's just stolen from me is going to come back. I don't know if I'm going to recognize him. I don't know if I'm going to correctly identify who he is. We think that when we eradicate that fear, that is a massive, massive benefit to our side of the house.
I thank the speaker for their speech and now invite up the third speaker of the affirmative.
Alright, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Should we care if a Scots College kid is getting caught or not when they're stealing their M&Ms? Or should we care if a woman is racially profiled by a facial recognition technology on her birthday for something that she didn't even do? We, in this debate, stand for the vulnerable. We stand for the people who are going to be harmed the most from this. We don't even care if we end up catching the kids who are stealing some M&Ms. We don't think this is entirely important in this debate at all, and we see that we should be focusing on the people who are going to be harmed by this. So what does this look like? 3 points of clash. Firstly, what will happen if AI are determining who are these criminals? Secondly, what happens when this is left up to the employee? And thirdly, just their generic clash on prevention. So, firstly, based on AI, let's talk about this, right? Why is it going to be racist? Why is it going to be biased? Because it requires biometric scanning. What does this look like? It looks like it being trained on previous data of a generic sample of a population, which is done in Silicon Valley. We see in the past that this has not been done well, that it is not able to recognize different facial structures. For example, people in Asia could open up anyone's iPhone because it couldn't recognize their different biometric structure. We've given you many examples of this down the line. They have not rebutted why this is not true and why this will possibly change on their side of the house. Secondly, we tell you here that even if it's able to distinguish them a little bit, even if it's just going off their old records, right, it's still going to be biased because it doesn't have as rigorous training on minorities, because supermarkets are not the people who are going through this. They are not the ones who own the tech companies, and they have no incentive to do this, right? So let's look at some specific things from here, right? They told us that it's just going to be done off the existing record, so therefore it's all going to be fixed. Well, that's just not true, right? Sure, they have an existing record. What does it then look for when it's doing this? What's its checklist, right? It goes through what it's been taught in the past. Sure, even if it's not AI, it still has to be trained, so then it goes through what it does in the past. It goes through a checklist of, do they look like this? Does their nose look like this? Do their eyes look like this? What is their skin color? And it goes through this checklist to identify them. We see that when minorities are not as rigorously processed through the system, it's not able to identify these smaller differences between their nose shape, between the size of their forehead or their brow or anything. We see that this is just not something that it is able to do because it has not been taught to do this. So what does this look like, right? They then told us that it's going to be like data like of a record of years, tens of years back, right? This is going to be great because people could never do this. So this is great for AI. We tell you that these people have likely like gone to prison. They've already done their time. They're no longer blacklisted from the store. They're now just being kicked out for something they didn't do. This really is not that important in the debate. They secondly told us that one scandal and it's all going to be fixed. Finn already bought you material on the incentives here on why this is not going to be true. Riley already brought you material on why racist narratives in the media are going to mean that these people are going to be shut down. They don't have the ability to bring them to the court because sure, they might be a rich Māori boy. That doesn't mean that they have the backing and the support that they need because they have been disenfranchised. They have gone through centuries of oppression. They do not have this like power to take someone to the Supreme Court because they suspect racism in a system which they have no way to prove. If they can mechanize it, they can maybe somehow prove that these systems are biased, which means that they have to consent, tell us that that is biased, then maybe they can win this. But we see that this is just so unlikely, so unfeasible. It's maybe one case in a million, and that this just will not happen. And that even if these systems are revised, the supermarkets still have very little incentive to fix this because they have no ability to influence massive tech companies in Silicon Valley who do not train their AI based on Pacifica faces, based on Māori faces, and so their biometrics will not be as rigorous. Alright, moving on, what does this look like? At the end of this point, what do we see? We see that in our best case, we have a very, very racist system who's going to be pinging every Māori, every Pacifica person that walks into the store who looks a little bit like someone who's on the store's previous record. We see that these people are going to be stopped. They're going to be humiliated in front of the whole store. I'll get into this a little bit later as well, but they're going to be humiliated in front of the whole store. They're going to go through all of these things that Riley talked you through at first. We see this is hugely, hugely important because these people already are seen as lower by some people. By some people, they already are disenfranchised. They already are like going and experiencing racism every day in their community. We see that by worsening this, this cannot possibly be good. We see that in our best case, sure, maybe they're not very racist. They're still going to be more racist because they are not trained specifically in New Zealand. New Zealand has no way to specifically train these people. And even if the employee bias still exists, which I'm going to get into now on my second point of clash, but first I will take a POI.
In your first speech, you said that corporations have a profit incentive to make money. If this AI is, why would corporations keep a badly trained AI that lets white guys steal their product and then scares black people away from spending money in that store?
Because supermarkets do not have the ability to influence this technology. They do not have the ability, they have no stake in these technology companies. They are not big international businesses that can do this. And they have no way to develop this technology themselves because they do not have the infrastructure. It would just be them entering a completely different market. This is not feasible. It is not something that they would do. All right, moving on then. What does it look like if, let's say that this AI or this like facial recognition technology is awful and it's all left up to the employees as is the status quo? What do we see? Well, what have they told us? They told us that, well, people on the teller are just going to have to call guards when they recognize people. This is really bad. You know, like, it's just going to be terrible for this 15-year-old employee. Finn already told you, yeah, sure, there are guards there. The 15-year-old employee isn't going to be asked to apprehend a 6-foot-tall man. This is just, like, not something that is happening in the status quo. Second time, we see that if you're being, like, recognized, we see here that what they told us then is that the facial recognition technology is instead better than an employee because it's just going to ping them as soon as they enter the store, and therefore it's not going to be humiliating, far less humiliating than having to talk to an actual person. Why is this not true, right? If you walk into the store, you're recognized instantly, you're pinged, right? It then looks like you're sent outside. You're not allowed entry into the store. This means that you have to fight to talk to a manager, fight to talk to someone who can possibly appeal your case if you are innocent or if you've been wrongly, like, pinged and hit for this. We see that then you're in front of the entire parking lot. You're in front of your entire community being shamed more so than you would be on our side of the house. We see that then you're having to deal with people one-on-one who do not have access to these records, who do not have access to this technology, who cannot prove what they believe, and this is going to create a bigger scandal than if it was an AI who was correct. Right, lastly on this, what did they tell us? They told us that, well, employees are just going to be so scared of the punishment that's going to come from them. They're going to be so scared they're not going to want to do this. They then also told us that it's really bad because people jump to conclusions and they're just going to go and apprehend anyone because of their, like, racist beliefs. Firstly, this is quite an internal clash here, right? This does not equal less profiling. This equals people are either going to trust their bias and go and instantly apprehend people, or they're going to be really cautious because their manager is, like, instilling fear in them. They cannot have both at the same time. What do we see is more likely? People are selfish. They're probably more likely to want to protect themselves than possibly catch a shoplifter. They're more likely to, like, really think it through, go through a couple of minutes, look at the photo back and forth a couple of times. They're actually going to be much more rigorous, and that sort of thing. So people are going to be making less mistakes. In their best case, this is just not true. What do we see when we also add technology to the mix? Well, when you're being pinged by technology and they're saying, oh look, this could be someone, right? When they're being pinged by technology, there's none of this cross-referencing, right? There's none of this that goes on. There's no thought process in their head about what could possibly happen. We see that this is just insane, and it means that on their side of the house, they're not going to be apprehending new shoplifters because they're relying on the records, employees are getting complacent. They're not going to be apprehending current shoplifters because they're not sure if it's the right person or not, and they're so scared of their managers. And thirdly, if they are, they're trusting their biases, and they still have this racism on their side of the house. Therefore, they do not fix anything. Very last thing here about prevention, we've already talked about why this is just so not true. But thirdly, I'm not even going to spend much time on this because we don't think it's important. Sure, you might get a higher rate of prevention if you're trusting AI to do this, but this is just not that important in the debate. If you're stopping M&Ms being stolen, if you're stopping a piece of fruit being stolen, we don't care if you're then also racially profiling a large number of people which have gone through this oppression for a very long point of time, and they're very, very vulnerable people. We see that we should be protecting these people, which is way easier to do when you have people doing this and not some sort of facial recognition technology just pinging them. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech and now invite the third speaker of the negative team.
Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Each person of colour has a different nose, eyes, and stature. Each innocent minority shopper does not match to recognition software, which its only purpose is to match specific facial structures, to the thief from last week. But to a human who is still stressed out about the $200 worth of alcohol stolen from them, it definitely might. 3 clashes for you here. Firstly, on biases, which Aff has tried to tell us is the only, has basically taken this to be the only point in this debate. Secondly, on crime, and then thirdly, on the effects of workers, the people who are having to deal with this theft every single day. So, starting off with biases, I'd like to quickly remind you that at the start of first Aff's speech, they told us verbatim, supermarkets are greedy. Now, we have told you at Neg throughout our case exactly why, let me restart that. Supermarkets are greedy, right? They've then spent their case telling us that these are inaccurate and racist technology which won't actually change anything and won't actually stop crime, completely ignoring that their idea from the start that supermarkets are greedy means that they actually won't want to invest in this if there's no actual benefit to them because it is so racist, because it is not actually helping anything. We think that they also, as we've told you, have additional incentives not to do this if there's any possibility of bias, right? We think those incentives are, firstly, like we've told you, the idea of as soon as one person is wrongly profiled, which we think is we think that one person being racially profiled or something like that and then stepping up is something that is likely because we think that people don't like to be racially profiled for crimes that they don't commit. We think it doesn't actually matter that much that they're a minority because if you're a minority who's being accused of a crime and your mother's really pissed off about it and she has the money to do it, because we know that not all minorities are just poor people who can't do anything, she is going to take the steps. Even if those steps aren't going to the Supreme Court, they are going to a news website, they are going to tell your local community, hey, we're being racially profiled. And that is always going to harm the reputation and potentially cost the supermarket money, right? So we always think that that's always not going to be, they have the incentive not to do that for that reason. We also think they have this incentive not to because they want profits. Again, supermarkets are greedy. Now, the other team has told us that when this happens, A, minorities won't come into stores because they won't trust them, and B, will let white shoplifters go away. We actually think that profit incentives mean that A, they want white shoplifters to be gone just as much as they want Māori shoplifters to be gone, and B, they want minorities buying their food because they want everyone to buy their produce so they can get the most money ever, right? So what we've got here is that like they actually have no incentives from the start to invest in a technology that is always going to be biased and inaccurate. So we don't actually think that this is happening. Additionally, we also think that this is always going to be better than human bias. Like I told you in my introduction, humans are flawed in that we don't all have like a degree in facial anatomy to understand that, and we are just an average 9-to-5 worker who's trying to stop ourselves and our store from getting robbed, right? We think that humans are always going to be, and we've told you at Nicola and Teresa, always going to be more likely to profile a young boy who is wearing the same school uniform as the boy from last week or looks kind of similar and be more stressed out about that and then be following them and leading to worse outcomes there. So what we're telling you here is that the bias is always going to be worse on their side. They haven't given us any reason why like humans won't be biased in that way, and we're telling you that we have incentives from the start to not have this bias on our for our stakeholders. Yeah. Yes. Hello.
Yeah, do you think that AI has more power to catch people because it can envision like a larger area of the supermarket?
I don't think that's what this is about. I think this is about the fact that AI has large ability to catch people because it has the ability to recognize every individual feature of a face, right? Secondly, on crime. Firstly, we've told you from the start that this is both a deterrent from crime and is more likely to catch criminals when they do commit crimes. Why is this a deterrent from crime? Because if people believe that like their face is going to be put into a software, they believe that they're more likely to be caught, which is always going to be a deterrent from crime, in the same way that DNA fingerprinting deters people from crime, because you never want to go commit a crime if you think there's a much higher chance that you're going to be caught for said crime. And B, we think that people who are always going to be skeptical are going to be like more like less likely to go into a store that has all of this stuff and all of this like this recognition technology, and so we think that that's less likely to happen from the start. We think that when there are criminals, we're much more likely to catch you from what we've told you down the line on why this technology is effective and why it works, right? So what we're getting here is that, oh, and by the way, the other side has basically just told us that A, people will get complacent. We think that's okay because we think this technology works. Again, like we've told you, we don't actually think that harms anyone. And B, people will go to other stores. We think that there are other deterrents in other stores. For example, a smaller store is going to have one employee that can see all of the store and see you when you're trying to grab that bag of chips. And so there's going to be other deterrents there. We don't think that that's something that's likely going to be happen. We think that those smaller stores are also more able to get those criminals then. So what we're getting here is we're helping to lower crime. We think that is always good because crime is always bad. It's harmful to a lot of different people. On the fact that crime is harmful, moving to my third thing, on the effects of workers, which AF has kind of tried to play down and kind of ignore our point on workers, but we actually think they are really important in this case, and we think that it is really important that we're protecting our workers in the best way possible. On AF's side, a worker has to directly, either they're telling us they're not going to have to directly confront a thief themselves, and we think, okay, even if they don't directly confront a thief themselves, they're going away from their work to have to deal with this thief, right, or this alleged thief, right? They're having to make sure that they're this is actually a person and they're not being biased, and so we think this takes away from their work. This is scary to have these thieves in stores. We think on our side what we get people who feel more safe because they feel like there's technology that's going to be able to accurately get this, right? And so we think that that's better. We also think that workers are less a part of this, and we think that when a worker does, or when a security guard does have to interact with a criminal, the onus is now not on them. It's not, hey, I saw you stealing. It's, hey, our software got you, and so now you're going to have to leave the store. And we think that's always going to lead to less confrontation, because we think it's more of a direct conflict when you have one person saying you stole that ham and the other person saying no, I didn't, rather than one person saying, on our software, we saw that you sold some ham last week. Sorry, we can't let you in the store, right? It takes it away from that person and makes it something that is more machine-based, right? And we think that that's always going to lead to less stress for workers there, right? So essentially what we're getting there is that workers aren't having to worry about this, which is always going to be helpful to them, their mental health, and we think that that's always really important, and it leads, more importantly, to a healthier workplace, which again has people who are able to focus on their jobs and not focus on trailing a woman and apprehending her 3 different times and saying, hey, how's it going with those shoppings? Or apprehending her and saying, hey, I saw you steal those ham. Either way, that's taking away from their work and that's harming them. So at the end of the day, what we've got here is we believe that there's not actually these biases here, or even if there are these biases, companies aren't incentivized. We think what we then get is we actually get much less crime, which we think is like the most important part of this debate, and we're also helping the workers. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and as customary in our switch the speaking orders, I invite the leader of the negative team to give their reply.
On our side, there's only one option, and it's an accurate catch of a reoffender in your store. Under their side, there's two situations. One with a discreet, non-threatening shoplifter who just would usually go under the radar because of employee apathy, because of the difficulty that there is for an employee to recognize or remember this person, right? That's the first situation on their side of the house, which doesn't happen. For us, and the outcomes are that this person continues to shoplift, maybe even at a more vulnerable business, right? And that has harms of like, they get a taste for crime, they know they won't get caught. That's a general harm in the fact that we do actually think that we should deter crime in the society and we should punish crime when someone steals from a shop. We think that's really bad and we should probably give them the consequences for their actions. So that's the first situation, not great. But the second and more harmful situation under their side of the house, which we do clash on in this debate, is what happens when it's an individual who ends up getting profiled because society sees them society unfairly sees them as a threat or unfairly profiles their like actions of crime based on their features, right? And we think that under their side, that looks like when a threatening looking or whatever that means, individual who comes into the store and attempts to come back into the store and management sees them as a threat. What we think happens on their side is that their traits get profiled, right? Management thinks it's worth it to just kick any lookalike out just to ensure that you won't get this person coming back. And then we explain to you that that has infinite harms on innocent individuals, worse on their side of the house, which both sides agree is really bad. But there are sort of three groups in this debate, right? Firstly, the employees, secondly, the innocent individuals, and thirdly, the reoffenders themselves or the shoplifters or their action of shoplifting. So I'm going to deal with that first because I think that I'll just get it out of the way, right? They tell you that they don't care if we don't catch shoplifters, right? Even though we tell you down the line why it's really important to deter crime in a society with crime rising, why we tell you it's so important to break that cycle for that person and to protect the employees from having to deal with it in the future, right? We tell you three reasons. Firstly, people should face consequences for their actions. Tit for tat, it's how the world goes round. At first speech, we explain that we think shoplifters are being antisocial, they're committing a crime even if a low level. We think that might have flow-on effects. But secondly, shoplifting does have those effects on the company and employees. And at third, we explain to you that taking profits from supermarkets or employees is just not fair. And we do think shoplifting is bad. And we do think you should punish it. You should deter it. We think we do that well. We also think we avoid the harms that they get under their side of the house, right? Again, crime turns into crime. People get addicted to it. That's an additional harm that we prove to you at our third speech. But secondly then, let's talk about those employees that get harmed and the additional bystanders. So on this profiling issue, it's a big push from big sides. It's not the only one, but we're talking about innocent and often otherwise marginalized groups here, so we do think it's very important, and it's a very important stakeholder. Why do we reduce harm to innocent people? Firstly, we have fewer mismatches under our side of the house. Firstly, the accuracy from the machine is better than a human, as we explained to you at first, second, and third. Secondly, the memory is better, so it's just, a machine has longer storage than a human brain, right? We think that that's good. And then thirdly, there's no human flaws of exhaustion and fear and worrying that you're just not going to catch the guy and so you're just going to throw everyone out of the store who looks like him, right? But secondly, on that, there are fewer charged mismatches, fewer racist mismatches, fewer classist mismatches. We get rid of a large amount of profiling under our house when we just let the machine pick whose nose is the same and make sure and have that security guard standing there checking it, right? Rather than this manager who just has racially profiled a guy who came in 2 weeks ago as, a Maori boy in the school uniform, and therefore I'm going to kick everyone else out, right? We think that profiling harm gets worse on their side of the house. But secondly, you have this thing of like worried employees wanting to, being willing to give up fairness for comfort, right? Because we tell you that actually employees are scared of crime. They are a stakeholder we should care about, including because their actions flow on to the other harms that we talk about in this debate.
I thank the speaker for their speech. I now invite the leader of the Affirmative team to give their reply.
What we told you is that AI or not, if you take a computer and the first time that it sees a Māori face, you say, this is what a criminal looks like, it is going to go one step further down the criminal flowchart every time that it sees a tangata Māori. All you had to buy was that in order for us to win the debate. 2 points of clash here. Firstly, on profiling, which both sides have agreed is the most important, and secondly, on crime prevention. So on profiling, note that they gave you this characterization of like, ye old racist shopkeep with the community notice board. We told you that this, we're talking about PAK'nSAVE in New World, so it's unlikely that they're going to be turning Māori boys away based on their uniform. They talked about community notice boards, but we told you about capacity. Like in my speech and in Riley's POI, we said it's just like the old racist shopkeep and the community notice board can only profile so many people, whereas AI with cameras that can see the whole shop can amplify that harm. Even if you don't buy this and the community notice board exists as the alternative only on our side, even at our worst, these are confirmed shoplifters that have been found by poring over security tapes. On their side, comparatively, they can never have perfect accuracy, so you have to give us some benefit on this point. The second thing, which they tell us, is that AI doesn't fail. It's like far better than humans. That's a completely other debate, but what we can't deny is that AI is not perfect. They accused us of this ambitious characterization. I don't know about you two, I don't want to hear that from a team that is assuming perfect technology and not giving us any even if material about what if the tech isn't perfect. It is reasonable to assume that the AI or facial recognition or biometrics, whatever it is, whatever they want it to be, it is reasonable to assume that it will fail. It is not reasonable to assume that this is going to be working perfectly, and it is reasonable to assume that this will require some degree of training data. Then they talk about the Supreme Court going to fix profiling by making supermarkets make this better. Who has more to fear from the Supreme Court? It's not going to act as an incentive to AI, because if it had the capability of not profiling, supermarkets would have just done that. I gave you lots of material, Riley gave you lots of material, and Stella, about why the supermarkets just aren't going to be affording quality data. It's not going to be coming from New Zealand, and as I've said, it's reasonable to assume that this technology will require some degree of training data. We mechanised crystal clear why you get bias. We told you it's not built to work in New Zealand, it picks up US bias, and it doesn't work for faces other than those in Silicon Valley. What I said, and what Riley POI'd, is that even if you buy that the old racist guy only exists on our side and he's only in charge of asset retention on our side, at the end of the day, if AI is slightly racist and you put cameras all over the store, putting that AI in the tech, you make racism substantially more powerful. So you can get tech racism and human racism, or in our worst, you can just get human racism. Very happy to stand for our side on that point. We may, in terms of meta, we weigh this much higher than workers, and as we've both agreed throughout the debate, this is the most important point. To margin build on crime prevention. Again, their case falls apart when they assume a perfect AI and do not tell us what happens when AI inevitably isn't perfect. What we say, they also say that they get rid of harms done against workers and fear against workers by getting them off the front line and making AI do that instead. What we told you is that AI is never going to talk to the 6-foot guy, it can only tell someone to talk to him. We told you that actually you just get rid of jobs, you cut human presence, and they partially conceded this. Note that all of our outcomes of this went unresponded to, and our mechanisms of why this is bad. Get rid of human connection, you harm, you get job losses, you make supermarkets worse, more profiling place. When they admit this, and when they lose the profiling point, they ultimately have to lose the debate. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech. I now invite both teams to cross the floor and shake hands.
Nice job.
Thanks for the debate.
Thank you.
Well done.
Good job. That's really good. Thank you. Well done. It was on a Google Doc. I was worried that.
And then how do I publish?
I think it was
I think it's all automatic.